So, if he's paid his money, he's paid, we believe, around about £5 million. Why is that not the end of it?
I think the minimum the British public expect from any politician, but certainly someone who's been the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is that they would have paid all their taxes without having to be prompted to do so, or harassed or campaigned against to do so. And the position to me is completely untenable. And I think the Prime Minister's got to act, and we'll see that very quickly today.
Why?
Because people, quite rightly, want all of their politicians to abide by the rules. They want anyone in public life to not see paying tax as somehow an optional thing that if you're caught out, you have to go back and do. They want that probity up front, that accountability, that professionalism, that integrity. And that hasn't been the case here. I don't think the excuses are compelling. Clearly, a great many people have received lawyers' letters when they've even queried whether the right amount of tax has been paid. And the sums of money here are not small. I mean, if the reports are true, the amount of income that hasn't been declared would be very, very large indeed. And I just don't think in any way it's tenable to continue in a high-profile position in public life when you've not behaved in that way.
But if it's a genuine mistake, and as soon as you have been made aware by HMRC that it was they have accepted that it was a mistake, that he didn't do it on purpose, and he's immediately paid the amount of money that's owing plus a 30% penalty as well, we believe. What else can he do? Well,
the two things I would immediately say are, first of all, if that settlement were reached whilst that person were Chancellor of the Exchequer and in charge of HMRC, that would be surely an enormous conflict of interest, and that's why there would have to be the publication of correspondence and transparency in that area as well. But also, how would that explanation tally against sending threatening letters to people who did query whether the tax affairs were correct? Surely if you'd made an honest mistake and somebody pointed it out, you would look at it and then correct that mistake rather than ask them to stop speaking publicly about the mistake that you'd made.
He was Chancellor, we believe, at the time that he made this payment, but he wouldn't necessarily have known that he was being investigated.
Well, I don't think in this position, based on what we do know, it's possible for that person, in this case Nadhim Zahawi, to claim ignorance and claim that there's nothing he could have done about that. I mean, this is a set of circumstances which I would say are completely untenable with remaining with a senior position in public life, and the Prime Minister has to take action to correct that.
Mr Zahawi says that the HMRC have accepted, at least in part, that these shares were for his father in this Balshore offshore company in Gibraltar, and they have accepted that, but they were disputing the number of shares. He says that if he hadn't had a senior position in government, then he would have been contesting that. But because he has had a senior position in government at the time, he felt that his job was to settle it quickly and then he could get on with his very important job.
Well, the kind of arrangement that's being talked about, I would say, is an unusual arrangement in terms of financing a company or a new venture. I'm afraid I'm just not convinced. And the danger is that the public see a case like this, and let's be honest, this is not the first sleazy or questionable bit of activity from this government, and they just think all politics and public life revolves in this way, and it doesn't. And it undermines the probity of the country, and it undermines the confidence people have in the political system. So I'm afraid I'm not willing to accept those kind of explanations. I don't think what we already know can be tallied with maintaining that senior position in public life.
But the tax lawyer who says that he's discovered these discrepancies, Mr Needles, says that he can only see about £99,000. So if he's got this fantastic tax legal mind and he could only find that much, how should we expect somebody like Nadhim Zahawi, who's very busy running the finances of the country, to know any more than that?
Well, I think, first of all, we should thank campaigners for tax transparency and openness, because
He is a Labour Party member.
Well, I think it is fair to say, if you look at the transparency and the light that Dan Needle has shone on these affairs and the threats that he received in exchange for that, I don't think his politics, his personal choices are irrelevant to that. I think he's done the country a service. I think we should all want to live in a country where there is that kind of transparency and scrutiny of our politicians. But very clearly, this is not a standard set of arrangements in terms of the tax affairs of the chairman of the Conservative Party. Clearly, there are questions to answer. Transparency would have helped that, but I see no indication that we would have got this had it not been for those campaigners looking into this and publishing what they had found.
I've said member. I don't know if he's a Labour Party member or a Labour Party supporter, do you?
I don't know.
OK, what about the chairman of the BBC? What should happen to him?
Well, that clearly needs investigating. And again, here we are talking about behaviour in public life, which is not how this country should operate. I'm fed up of having to come and talk about this, even though it's the Conservative Party who are always at the heart of it. We should be talking about the cost of living crisis, or how we should be making the most of the exciting new opportunities that could be available to the country. But again, time and time again, we've got to talk about this because it is newsworthy, it is important to cover it. But it's not how things should be in this country. And there seems no end, to be honest, under this government. It feels very much like the end of the last Conservative government compared to the 1990s when they fell from power at that point. And I'm frustrated by it, to be honest. But clearly there are huge questions of a conflict of interest here between someone being involved in arranging a substantial amount of money for the then Prime Minister and then receiving one of the highest appointments in public life, again, that it's possible to get.
And that BBC chair, Richard Sharp, does he not have questions to answer?
Yes. I mean, clearly. I mean, the fact that people think it might be OK.
What would you want to ask him?
I'd want to know when he first had conversations about this role, when and how that related to the other request to arrange a substantial sum of money for the then Prime Minister. I would want to know the relationship between those two things, but I also want to know how the Conservative Party themselves think this looks OK. Imagine it's all above board. Imagine we find that out. Do they not see that this looks inappropriate as a way to behave as a government? And I think, frankly, they've just been in power for too long. They have forgotten who put them into power and the responsibility and faith that was placed in them. And until they have the shock of having that power taken away from them, they'll not be willing to look seriously at their own behaviour and how they continually get into these scandals.
Is it not reasonable for the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, going back a few, but the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to have a dinner away from the public spotlight with somebody who could be chairman of the BBC? He needed to check him out, and also a cousin of his at Chequers. What's wrong with that?
I don't think the dining arrangements of the former Prime Minister are the question here. I think it always comes down to the fact that there are continually these enormous conflicts of interest, whether it's the scandal around procuring PPE in the pandemic, or the tax affairs of senior Conservative members of the Cabinet, or situations like this where people have received very significant appointments or other roles that are, incredibly important in how this country operates. And it comes back to their core credential being not just political support for the Conservative Party, but often personal financial arrangements that are intertwined with senior Conservatives. I don't think the public thinks that is in any way acceptable. And I want to know why senior Conservatives continue to think that is an acceptable way to behave.
We were talking just before we came on air about how cold it is today. The National Grid is saying that they're trying to put things in place to try and stop blackouts, so you shouldn't use as much energy at tea time tonight. That's easier said than done, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I think whilst advice about how, the weather conditions affect energy consumption, all of that should be part of an educated and involved energy system. But the bottom line is this. We have enormous resources in this country. We can finally get to a position where we can combine low-carbon energy with energy security and a low competitive price because of how the relative price of fossil fuels has risen. The message from government, not just regulators, the message from government should be how we make the most of that, how we maximise the opportunities of that. And it shouldn't be a message that people think, is this about rationing my own use? Because, of course, we should all use energy efficiently. But the story there should be about the massive opportunities available to the country, which right now this government are completely not seizing. We're being completely outgunned by what's happening with the Biden administration in the US and how the European Union will then respond to that. We are missing out on these opportunities.
He's got his own problems to deal with at the moment.
Well, exactly. This Prime Minister is dealing with internal Conservative Party problems when actually what we need is a government focused on the big opportunities of the future.
Biden's got his own problems as well. Given that we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, is it right that we have a 3-day extravaganza for the coronation?
Well, I think if you're going to have a hereditary monarchy, you're probably going to make a big deal of coronations. I'm not aware of the plans. I'm not aware of the scale of it. I would usually expect it to be done in a certain way. So, look, to be honest, haven't looked at that, don't have a particularly strong view on that, but I would always expect a coronation to be a fairly significant event in this country's history.
Well, does it need to be 3 days?
I honestly don't know whether that's the standard procedure because it's so long since we've had one, or whether this is a new proposal put forward. But look, I think one thing you would absolutely say about the tragic passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth was that it was a moment where the country came together. I did actually quite like that, even though, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily this would be my default as to how the head of state should be organised. But look, it brought the country together, and I think that was quite an important moment. If a coronation can do the same, that would be nice.